the air in the Miller and Sons. John Deere dealership was thick with the smell of new paint, fresh rubber, and the faint, clean scent of diesel that hadn't yet been burned. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. It was April of 1973, and money was flowing through the Corn Belt like a spring flood. Clayton Vance was soaking in it, leaning back in a padded chair, the pen still warm in his hand from where he'd just signed his name on a line that stretched out into a string of numbers long enough to make a preacher cuss. Across the polished desk, Frank Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of 50 years of farming seasons, slid the paperwork into a neat folder. "Well, Clayton," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "She's all yours. One brand new John Deere, our 4630, sound guard cab, air conditioning, the whole works. Finest tractor we've ever had on this lot." Clayton puffed out his chest. At 35, he was the golden boy of Prairie Creek Township. He'd taken over his father's modest 300 acres, and, in less than a decade, leveraged it into a 2,000-acre empire of corn and soybeans. "She'll pay for herself in one season, Frank. One season. You gotta spend money to make money. Get big or get out. That's what I say." He gestured out the wide plate glass window. The 4630 sat gleaming in the sun, its green paint so deep you could fall into it, the iconic yellow deer seeming to leap right off the hood. It was a monster, a 6-cylinder turbocharged beast pushing 150 horsepower at the PTO. It made the tractors of his father's generation look like garden toys. Just then, the bell over the door tinkled, a sound as old as the dealership itself. Both men turned. Framed in the doorway was Silas Blackwood. Silas was a relic, a man carved from the same tough oak as the posts that fenced his land. His overalls were worn but clean, his hands thick and calloused, the knuckles permanently stained with the ghosts of grease and oil. He was 68 years old and farmed the same quarter section his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. He still used a Farmall M, a tractor that had been built before Clayton Vance had been born. He gave a short nod. "Frank." "Clayton." "Silas," Frank said, his tone shifting from salesman to something more familiar, more patient. "What can I get for you? Need a gasket for that old M. Maybe some points and plugs?" Clayton smirked, not bothering to hide it. "Don't tell me the old girl finally threw a rod, Silas. Maybe it's time you put that red relic out to pasture and got yourself a real tractor." He patted the paperwork on Frank's desk. "This is what a real tractor looks like." Silas's eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, flickered toward the new 4630 outside, then back to Clayton. He didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at Frank, his expression unreadable. "Actually, Frank, I'm here to buy some tractors." Frank's eyebrows went up. Clayton let out a short, barking laugh. "Finally saw the light, did you, old man?" Clayton jeered. "Gonna trade in that museum piece? What are you thinking, a 4030? Might be a bit much for you to handle." Silas ignored him, his gaze fixed on the dealer. "I want 12 John Deeres, and I need them today." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend steel. Frank Miller stared, his mouth slightly agape. Clayton Vance full-on guffawed, slapping his knee. 12? 12? Good Lord, Silas, what are you gonna do? Start your own dealership? You planning on plowing the whole state of Iowa?" Frank finally found his voice, a strained, careful thing. "Silas, that's a lot of iron. A new 4630 like Clayton's here is running close to $25,000. 12 of them. Well, that's $300,000. Are you feeling all right?" Silas reached into the bib of his overalls and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and a worn leather wallet. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the counter, It was a list, written in a neat, deliberate pencil script. "I don't want one of them newfangled jukeboxes on wheels," Silas said, his voice as steady and low as a tractor at idle. "I want what you got out back, in the boneyard." Frank picked up the list. His eyes scanned the words, and his jovial salesman's mask dissolved into pure confusion. 3 Model Gs, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. 4 Model As. 5 Model Bs. "Silas, these are 2-cylinder parts tractors. They haven't run in 20 years. Some of them have seized engines. They're scrap." Clayton peered over Frank's shoulder, his face a mask of contemptuous disbelief. "You're buying junk, a fleet of junk. What in God's name for?" "That's my business," Silas said quietly. He opened his wallet and began laying $100 bills on the counter. They were old bills, worn soft as cloth. He'd been saving them for a long time. "I figure they're worth about scrap price, $100 apiece. That's $1,200. I'll pay you cash right now. You just have to haul them over to my place." Frank Miller was stunned. He looked from the pile of cash to Silas's dead serious face, then back to the list of forgotten tractors rusting away behind his workshop. He'd been planning to call the scrapper next month anyway. This was found money. It was also madness. "It's your money, Silas," he said, shaking his head as he began to count the bills. Clayton just stood there, a look of pity and disgust on his face. "You've finally lost it, Silas. Truly. While I'm out here making a living, you're going to be in your shed playing with toys from the Great Depression. My one tractor could plow your whole farm before you could get one of those rust buckets to even turn over." Silas carefully folded his wallet and tucked it back into his overalls. He looked Clayton Vance square in the eye. "Your tractor isn't your tractor, son. It belongs to the bank in Des Moines. My tractors. They'll be mine, every last bolt." He turned and walked out the door, the little bell tinkling his departure, leaving the smell of new paint and big debt behind him. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Standing there in that dealership in 1973, which man would you have bet on? Would you take Clayton's deal? A brand new, top-of-the-line machine, financed to the hilt, with all the power and technology of the modern age? Or would you take Silas's deal, a dozen forgotten, broken-down pieces of American history, bought and paid for with cold, hard cash? Let me know in the comments which path you would have chosen, because the choice they made that day would echo through that county for the next 10 years. The flatbed truck from the dealership arrived the next morning, groaning under the weight of the first load. It was a sorrowful sight. A John Deere G, with one massive rear wheel sunk into the mud of its own slow decay, its green paint faded to a chalky, leprous grey. Next to it, 2 Model As, their narrow front ends looking like praying mantises, rust holes peppering their hoods like buckshot. Silas directed the driver to a spot behind his main barn, on a patch of high, dry ground he'd cleared the day before. As the driver unchained the load, the sound of another vehicle crunched up Silas's gravel lane. It was Earl Jessup, his nearest neighbor. Earl leaned out the window of his Ford pickup, a bewildered look on his face. "Silas? What in tarnation is all this?" Earl asked, gesturing at the rusting hulks. "New additions to the fleet, Earl," Silas said, a twinkle in his eye. The truck driver, a young kid who worked for Frank, tilted the bed. The tractors slid off with a series of protesting shrieks and a final, ground-shaking thud. A cloud of rust-colored dust puffed into the air. "Looks more like you're starting a scrapyard," Earl muttered, shaking his head as he drove off. By the end of the day, all 12 tractors were there, sitting in 3 neat rows. They looked like a graveyard of forgotten ambitions. Clayton Vance's words about a junkyard fleet seemed to hang in the air. The story was already all over the county. People took the long way home from town just to drive past Silas's place and gawk. The consensus at the coffee shop was unanimous. Old Man Blackwood had finally cracked. That evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky, Silas stood before his new acquisitions. He didn't see junk. He saw potential. He saw simple, honest engineering. He walked up to the big Model G, the worst of the lot. He laid a hand on its cold, pitted fender. The sheet metal was thick, forged in a time when steel was cheap and pride was everything. There were no plastic cowlings, no delicate circuit boards, just iron, grease, and gears. He went to his workshop. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was organized with a mechanic's precision. Wrenches hung in perfect order of size. Coffee cans held sorted nuts and bolts. On a heavy wooden bench sat his father's anvil, its surface smooth and scarred from 100 years of shaping metal. The air smelled of solvent, old oil, and hot coffee from the percolator in the corner. Silas started with the G. He knew its engine was seized solid. Years of rain down the unsheltered exhaust stack had welded the pistons to the cylinder walls with rust. This was the first test. He pulled the spark plugs and poured a homemade concoction of automatic transmission fluid and acetone down into the cylinders. He let it sit, letting chemistry do the slow, patient work of persuasion. For the next week, he attacked the rest of the tractor. He put a block under the frame and wrestled the giant, calcium chloride-filled rear tires off with a set of tire irons that were nearly as tall as he was. He drained the transmission, a thick, milky sludge oozing out that looked more like chocolate milk than gear oil. Every evening, after his regular farm chores were done, he'd return to the G's engine. He'd put a 6-foot breaker bar on the hand crank nut and lean into it with all his weight. Nothing. Not a budge. He'd tap the sides of the block with a ball-peen hammer, trying to shock the rust's grip loose with vibration. Still nothing. Clayton Vance drove by one afternoon in his air-conditioned pickup, slowing down to watch Silas straining on the breaker bar. Clayton just shook his head and sped off, a little cloud of dust in his wake. On the 8th night, Silas decided it was time. He'd let the penetrating oil do its work long enough. He positioned the breaker bar and gave it a heave. This time he felt something. It wasn't movement, but a deep, resonant groan from within the engine block, the sound of molecules crying out under immense pressure. He put more weight on it, his muscles cording in his arms and back. Then, with a crack that echoed through the quiet farmyard like a rifle shot, it broke free. The pistons hadn't moved. The head of the massive 3/4-inch bolt he'd been using to turn the crank had sheared clean off. Silas stumbled back, the breaker bar clattering to the concrete floor. He stood there, breathing heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. For a moment, a wave of doubt washed over him. Maybe Clayton and the others were right. Maybe this was a fool's errand. He looked at the broken bolt, then at the silent, stubborn engine. He walked over to the coffee pot, poured a black, steaming cup, and sat on an old milking stool. He didn't see failure. He saw a problem that needed a different solution. The direct approach hadn't worked. It was time to get smarter. The next day, he brought out his little buzz box, arc welder, and his cutting torch. Methodically, he began to dismantle the engine from the outside in. He pulled the valve cover, the rocker arm assembly, and then, with a grunt, the heavy cast-iron cylinder head. What he saw inside would have sent most men straight to the scrap dealer. The cylinder walls were deeply pitted, and a ridge of rust stood proud above where the pistons had stopped their travel a decade or more ago. But Silas had a plan. He spent 2 days with a ridge reamer and a cylinder hone. The hone, powered by his heavy-duty electric drill, buzzed and whirred, slowly, painstakingly grinding away the rust and pitting, restoring the cylinder walls to a smooth, cross-hatched surface. He measured with his calipers, again and again, ensuring everything was true. He built a heavy-duty press from an old hydraulic jack and some I-beams, and, one by one, pressed the rust-welded pistons out of the cylinders. The sound was a tortured screech of metal on metal. He salvaged the connecting rods, but tossed the old pistons and rings into the scrap barrel. He had a catalogue from a place in Dubuque that still sold oversized pistons and new rings for these old tractors. Weeks turned into a month. A new radiator core. New gaskets. He cut himself from a roll of material. He took the magneto apart on his kitchen table, cleaning every contact, carefully rewrapping the coil wire. He rebuilt the carburetor, his big, clumsy-looking fingers moving with the delicacy of a surgeon as he seated the tiny needle valve. Finally, the day came. The engine was reassembled. The tractor was back on its wheels, which now held new tires. He'd painted the engine block in classic John Deere green, the color of new life. He filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30-weight oil. He opened the petcock on the fuel sediment bowl, and clean gasoline trickled out. He climbed into the iron seat, the same seat that had held another farmer a generation ago. He checked the fuel, set the throttle, and pulled the choke. He didn't bother with the hand crank. He'd temporarily rigged up a 12-volt battery. He took a deep breath and pressed the starter button. The flywheel turned, slow and labored at first. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Then a cough, a puff of black smoke shot out of the straight exhaust pipe. Whoosh! Put! Whoosh! Put-put! And then it caught. The deep, rhythmic, unmistakable sound of a John Deere two-cylinder engine fired to life. Put-put-put-put. It wasn't a roar like Clayton's 4630. It was a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Each firing of a cylinder was a distinct event you could feel in your chest. It was the sound of pure, simple power. Silas eased the throttle forward. The putt-putt quickened its tempo, smoothing out into a steady, thumping rhythm. He looked out over the hood of his resurrected tractor, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. 1 down, 11 to go. By the spring of 1975, the world had changed. The oil embargo had sent fuel prices soaring, and grain prices had chased them right up into the stratosphere. Corn was fetching over $3 a bushel, a price that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. For farmers who were positioned to take advantage, it was a golden age, and no one was better positioned than Clayton Vance. He was the king of the county. His 4630, now 2 years old, was already looking like a wise investment. He'd added a brand new 4430 to his fleet, along with a massive 72700 turbo combine that could chew through 100 acres of corn in a day. He'd bought the quarter section to the north of his home place and was cash renting another 500 acres on top of that. He traded his pickup for a new Ford F-250 and bought his wife a Lincoln Continental, the longest car anyone in town had ever seen. When he walked into the co-op, men would stop talking and listen to what he had to say. He was the future. He was progress. He was winning. And Silas Blackwood? He was a curiosity, a punchline. His junkyard fleet was no longer junk. All 12 tractors were now fully restored. Lined up behind his barn, they gleamed with fresh green and yellow paint. Every engine ran like a top. He'd become a master of the two-cylinder, able to set the timing by ear and diagnose a carburetor issue by the color of the exhaust smoke. He farmed his quarter section with them. People would see him out in the field, a strange sight in the modern age. Instead of one massive tractor pulling a 24-foot disc, Silas would have 3 of his old Model Gs out there at once, each pulling a smaller 8-foot disc, chugging along in formation like a squadron of bombers. It was inefficient by modern standards, but Silas didn't care. His fuel bill was a fraction of his neighbor's. When one tractor had a minor issue, a fouled plug or a clogged fuel line, he'd just hop off, fix it in 10 minutes with the tools in his pocket, and get back to work. He never had to call a dealer. He never had a breakdown that cost him more than a few dollars and a bit of time. He had no debt. While others were paying staggering interest payments on their new equipment, every dollar Silas earned from the high grain prices went straight into his savings account at the local bank. He lived simply, his needs few. He was salting away a small fortune. But no one knew it. All they saw was the old man on his old tractors, a living fossil in a fast-moving world. One afternoon at the grain elevator, Clayton cornered him while Silas was waiting to unload his small gravity wagon of soybeans. Clayton pulled up in his new truck, the diesel engine rumbling with quiet power. "Still playing with your toys, Silas?" Clayton asked. He wasn't trying to be cruel. It was the condescending pity of a man who believes he has lapped everyone else in the race. "I heard you had 3 tractors out planting corn this spring. Took you a week to do what I can do in a day." Silas just nodded, watching the auger pull his beans from the wagon. "They got the job done." "Yeah, but at what cost?" Clayton pressed, leaning against his truck. "The cost of your time? You could be running another 500 acres, Silas, making real money. You just need to modernize. Frank would give you a great deal on a new planter, I'm sure." Silas finished his unloading, signed his scale ticket, and turned to face the younger man. The wind whipped across the flat prairie, carrying the sweet smell of drying corn. "My land is mine, Clayton," he said, his voice even. "Every square inch. I paid the last note on it in 1968. My tractors are mine. I paid for them with cash. My crop is mine. The money from this ticket is mine. Let me ask you something. Is that new truck yours? Is that combine yours? Is that extra 500 acres you're farming yours? Or does it all belong to the bank?" A flicker of anger, or maybe insecurity, crossed Clayton's face. "It's called leverage, Silas. It's how the modern world works. You have to use the bank's money to grow." "The bank's money always comes with strings," Silas replied, folding his ticket and putting it in his pocket. "And sometimes they pull on those strings." He climbed back into the cab of his old Chevy C50 grain truck and drove away, leaving Clayton standing alone in the dust. That winter, the boom continued. Land prices shot up. Farmers were using the equity in their rapidly appreciating land as collateral for even bigger loans to buy more land and more equipment. The banks were happy to oblige, handing out money with a smile. Interest rates were starting to creep up, but with commodity prices so high, nobody seemed to notice. Nobody except Silas. One evening in his workshop, listening to the radio as he lapped the valves on the last of his Model B engines, the regular music program was interrupted by a news bulletin. The announcer's voice was grave, talking about runaway inflation and a man named Paul Volcker being appointed as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. He spoke of a commitment to tame inflation at any cost. The words meant little to most people, just more noise from Washington. But to Silas, who had lived through the Depression, they sounded like a distant rumble of thunder on a clear day. A week later, Clayton Vance got a letter from the Farm Credit Bank. It was a form letter, filled with dry financial language. But one phrase stood out: adjustment to your variable interest rate loan, effective the 1st of next quarter. The rate was going up, only by a little, but it was the first time it had ever gone up. He tossed the letter on the pile of bills on his desk, dismissing it. It was just the cost of doing business. Out in the machine shed, His massive green tractors sat silent in the cold, waiting for a spring that promised to be the most profitable one yet. He didn't see them as assets tied to a loan. He saw them as monuments to his success, unaware that their very foundations were beginning to crack. The summer of 1980 began with a sky the color of brass. Day after day, the sun beat down on Prairie Creek Township, baking the moisture from the rich, black soil until it cracked into a mosaic of dry fissures. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, stood stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward, as if in prayer for a rain that never came. It was the kind of drought that old men spoke of in hushed tones. A ghost from the dirty 30s returned to haunt a new generation. For Clayton Vance, the drought was a physical manifestation of the anxiety tightening in his chest. His costs were fixed, written in the unforgiving ink of banknotes. The payments on his 2 big tractors, his combine, and the half-dozen loans that stitched his empire together came due whether it rained or not. His only hope was that his sheer acreage would compensate for the poor yield. If he could just get 100 bushels to the acre across 2,000 acres instead of his usual 150, he might still break even. The first real crack appeared not in the soil, but in the complex heart of his 7700 turbo combine. It was a blistering afternoon in late September, the air thick with dust and the smell of dying crops. Clayton was pushing the machine hard, trying to get the last of his brittle, disappointing soybeans out of the field before they shattered in their pods. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine erupted from the engine compartment, followed by a sickening clatter and a plume of greasy black smoke. The massive machine shuddered to a halt, silent save for the ticking of hot metal. Clayton slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the air in the sound guard cab suddenly feeling suffocating. He knew enough to recognize a catastrophic failure. This wasn't something he could fix with a wrench and a prayer. He had to call Frank Miller. The dealership service truck, a gleaming new Ford F-350 with a crane and a chest of specialized tools, arrived 2 hours later. The mechanic, a young man half Clayton's age with a laptop and a diagnostic kit, spent an hour poking and probing before delivering the verdict. "Turbo's shot, Mr. Vance. Looks like it threw a blade, and it went right through the intercooler and into the engine. Pistons are scored all to hell. She's gonna need a complete in-frame overhaul." Clayton felt the blood drain from his face. An overhaul? In the middle of harvest? How long? The mechanic shrugged, wiping grease from his hands with a clean rag. "We can get the parts. Probably take a week. But the bill? You're looking at $15,000, maybe $20,000. And that's if we don't find anything else once we tear it down." $20,000. It was a number that, just 2 years ago, would have been an annoyance. Now it felt like a death sentence. He had 1,000 acres of corn waiting, the stalks growing weaker by the day. He couldn't afford to wait a week. He couldn't afford $20,000. He had to hire a custom harvester, a man who charged by the acre and took his cut right off the top, further shrinking Clayton's already razor-thin margins. As his broken combine was loaded onto a lowboy trailer, a monument to his helplessness, he saw a plume of dust on the horizon. It was Silas Blackwood, driving one of his old Model A's, pulling a 2-row corn picker. It was a ridiculously antiquated setup, something you'd see in a museum. The picker was loud and slow, but it was working. As Silas chugged past on the county road, he gave a simple, neighborly wave. Clayton didn't wave back. He just stood there, watching the old man and his simple machine, a bitter taste like bile in his mouth. The news from the wider world was even worse. To combat inflation, the Federal Reserve had jacked up interest rates. Then, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The export market, the primary driver of the high prices that had fueled the boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator fell from over $3 a bushel to just over $2, and it was still dropping. Clayton received his next letter from the bank in November. The friendly tone was gone. His variable rate had been adjusted again. It was now 16%. The payment on his operating loan had nearly doubled. The letter informed him that due to the collapse in commodity prices and the subsequent drop in land values, his debt-to-asset ratio was now a matter of concern. They requested a meeting to discuss restructuring. Clayton sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the stack of bills and bank notices spread before him like a losing hand of cards. The numbers swam before his eyes. They were no longer symbols of his success, but chains pulling him under. For the first time, he felt the cold, terrifying truth of Silas's words from years ago. Nothing in his machine shed, nothing in his fields, truly belonged to him. It all belonged to a man in a suit in an office in Des Moines. And that man was pulling on the strings. The winter of 1981 was bleak and unforgiving. The snow came early and stayed late, a thick white blanket covering a landscape of quiet desperation. All across the Corn Belt, the machinery of the farm crisis was grinding into motion, slow and inexorable as a glacier. Auction notices began to appear in the county paper like obituaries. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet in the late 70s, leveraged to the hilt. Then it started to claim the more established farmers, men who had been pillars of the community for a generation. The coffee shop talk was no longer about yields and rainfall, but about interest rates and foreclosure. Clayton Vance fought like a drowning man. He sold his wife's Lincoln Continental. He sold a 40-acre parcel of timber he'd inherited from his grandfather. He sold his new pickup truck and bought an old, beat-up Chevy. Each sale was a small sacrifice, a desperate attempt to feed the insatiable appetite of the bank. But it was like trying to fill the ocean with a bucket. The interest rate on his loans ticked up to 18, then 21%. It was a number so absurd, so fundamentally impossible to overcome with the price of corn hovering at $2, that it felt like a joke. But the bank wasn't laughing. The letters became phone calls. The calls became registered letters. The man from the bank who had once taken him out for steak dinners to get his business now spoke to him in clipped, impersonal tones. His breaking point came on a cold March morning. He had just finished chores, the steam from his breath pluming in the frigid air of the barn, when he saw the car pull into his lane. It was a dark sedan, official-looking. 2 men in suits got out. They didn't come to the door. They walked around his machine shed, pointing, taking notes on a clipboard. They looked at the 4630, the 4430, the planter, the disc. They were taking inventory. They were pricing his life for the auction block. Clayton watched from the barn door, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This was the end. He had gotten big, and now he was getting out, just not in the way he had always bragged. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He thought of his father, who had farmed this same land with a fraction of the equipment and none of the debt, and had died a proud, solvent man. He had taken his father's legacy and gambled it away on the promise of progress. Meanwhile, Silas Blackwood's life continued in its steady, predictable rhythm. The crisis that was destroying his neighbors barely touched him. His fuel costs were low. He had no repair bills from the dealer. He had no loan payments. When he sold his corn for $2 a bushel, it was $2 of profit, not a desperate payment against a mountain of debt. He wasn't getting rich, but his lights stayed on and there was food on his table. His farm, once seen as a relic, was now an island of stability in a sea of chaos. His neighbors who had once pitied him now came to him for help. Not for money. No one had any of that. But for his skills. Earl Jessup's planter broke down, and the dealer wanted $500 for a new part. Silas took the broken piece into his workshop, heated it cherry red in his forge, and welded it back together, stronger than before. He charged Earl a sack of potatoes and a handshake. He became the unofficial mechanic for the township, keeping the old, paid-for machinery running for men who could no longer afford the new. He traded his work for firewood, for help fixing a fence, for a side of beef. The old ways, the ways of community and mutual support that had been forgotten during the boom years, were suddenly all that was left. One day, Frank Miller, the John Deere dealer, drove out to Silas's farm. He looked 10 years older than he had in 1973. His dealership was a ghost town. The lot was full of brand-new, unsold tractors and a growing collection of repossessed equipment from failed farms. "Silas," he said, his voice weary. "I'm calling in my inventory loans. The bank is forcing my hand. I'm going out of business." Silas poured him a cup of coffee. "I'm sorry to hear that, Frank." "It's not just me. It's everyone," Frank said, staring into his cup. "Clayton Vance. They're selling him out. The whole lot. Lock, stock, and barrel. The auction is Saturday." He looked up, his eyes meeting Silas's. "You were right, Silas, all those years ago, in my office. You were right, and we were all wrong. We flew too close to the sun." Silas didn't say, "I told you so." There was no triumph in it. There was only a deep, profound sorrow for the good men who were losing everything. He just nodded slowly. "Saturday, you say?" The day of the Vance Farm auction was grey and cold, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. It felt like a funeral. The whole county was there, their pickups lining the road for half a mile in either direction. They stood in huddled groups, speaking in low voices, their faces grim. This wasn't just about Clayton. It was about them. They were all just one bad year, one bank letter away from the same fate. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a relentless, emotionless chant that sliced through the somber quiet. He was selling off a man's life, piece by piece, wrenches, toolboxes, seed bags, livestock feeders. Each item brought a paltry sum, a painful reminder of its diminished worth. Clayton stood off to the side, near the machine shed, his wife beside him. He looked like a stranger on his own farm. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He watched as his neighbors and friends picked over the bones of his dream, bidding on the tools he had held in his own hands. Then the auctioneer moved to the big items. The machinery, the 7700 combine, its engine hastily repaired, sold for less than a third of what Clayton still owed on it. The 42430 went for a similar loss. Finally, they brought out the 4630. It was the first tractor he had bought, the symbol of his ambition, the gleaming green monster he had bragged about to Silas in the dealership all those years ago. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer barked. "A John Deere 4630, sound guard cab, runs good, a real workhorse. What'll you give me? Who'll start the bidding at $10,000? Silence. 10,000 was a fortune in these times. No one had that kind of cash. "Come on, folks. I'm bid 10,000. Who'll give me 5? 5,000. I got 5, now 6. Who'll give me 6? The bidding was slow, agonizing. A few farmers made tentative bids, pushing the price up in small increments. It stalled at $8,500. The auctioneer tried to coax more out of the crowd, but there was nothing left. $8,500 once, $8,500 twice, sold for 85. 10,000. The voice was quiet, but steady and clear. It cut through the auctioneer's chant and silenced the crowd. Every head turned. Standing at the back, near the edge of the crowd, was Silas Blackwood. He hadn't said a word all day. He just stood there, his hands in the pockets of his overalls. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 10,000 from the gentleman in the back. Now who'll give me 11? 10,500?" There were no other bids. The crowd just stared, a silent understanding passing between them. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "To Silas Blackwood for $10,000. Silas walked forward through the parted crowd and up to the auctioneer's clerk. He didn't pull out a checkbook. He reached into his bib overalls, the same way he had in the dealership, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He counted out 100 crisp $100 bills, cash he had saved from a decade of good harvests and no debt. He took the receipt and walked over to the 4630. He didn't climb up into the cab. He just laid a hand on the big rear tire. He looked across the yard and met Clayton's gaze. Clayton looked utterly broken, confused. He thought Silas had come to gloat, to deliver the final crushing blow of humiliation by buying his prized tractor for scrap value. Silas walked over to him, ignoring the stares of the crowd. He held out the receipt and a set of keys he'd gotten from the clerk. "She's a good tractor, Clayton," Silas said, his voice low enough that only Clayton could hear. "She just needs a man who knows how to run her right." Clayton stared at the keys, uncomprehending. What are you doing?" "Your father was a good man," Silas said. "He helped my father save his crop back in the flood of '48. Some debts don't get paid with money. This is your home place. A man needs a tractor to work his home place." He pressed the keys into Clayton's numb hand. "You can pay me back when you can. A little at a time. No interest." Tears welled in Clayton's eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed all day. He looked at the old man, at the quiet dignity in his weathered face, and the wall of pride and shame inside him finally crumbled. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, clutching the keys like a lifeline. That day changed everything. The story of what Silas did at the auction spread through the county faster than a prairie fire. He hadn't just bought a tractor. He had bought a man his dignity back. The quiet old farmer with his junkyard fleet was no longer a punchline. He was a legend. He was the man who had seen the storm coming and had built his ark out of old iron and common sense. The years that followed were hard, but the community, remembering the lessons of the crisis, pulled together. Clayton Vance never got big again. He farmed his home quarter section, the land the bank couldn't take, using the 4630 Silas had saved for him. He paid Silas back every dime over the next 10 years. He was a different man, quieter, humbler, and infinitely wiser. He and Silas became unlikely friends, bonded by the shared hardship of the land. Years later, well into the 1990s, Silas was in his workshop. He was older now, his movements slower, but his hands were just as steady. His grandson, a boy of about 16, was helping him work on one of the old Model Bs. "Grandpa," the boy asked, wiping grease from his hands, "why do we still use these old things? Dad says we could get a new tractor that would do the work of 3 of these." Silas stopped turning his wrench and looked at the boy. He gestured around the workshop, at the rows of his resurrected tractors visible through the open door. "Your dad's right," Silas said. "It would be faster, but speed isn't everything. Look here." He tapped the simple engine block of the Model B. "I can fix anything on this tractor with the tools on that wall. I own it, every last bolt. It doesn't own me." "There's a big difference?" He picked up a clean rag and wiped a spot of oil from the hood. Your generation, you'll see all sorts of new things. Things that promise to make life easier, faster, more profitable. And some of them will. But you just remember, the fanciest machine in the world isn't worth much if the bank owns the key. It's better to go slow on land you own than to go fast on land you're just borrowing. The boy nodded, the lesson sinking in. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farmyard. From a distant field, another sound drifted on the evening air. It was Clayton Vance, finishing his last round of planting with the 4630. And from Silas's own pasture, where his son was running one of the old Model Gs to rake hay, came that other, more familiar sound. Put, 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 put. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, the sound of patience, the sound of endurance. It was the steady, reliable heartbeat of a legacy that would outlast the rust and the changing times, a lesson written not in ink on a banknote, but in iron and oil on the enduring heartland of America.